Welcome to Real Turkey. I am Attila Yeşilada. Unfortunately, your regular host because he has plenty of time in his hands and really nothing to do because he's under self-quarantine. Today, we're going to talk largely about economics, IMF forecasts as they pertain to Turkey, but also the good news pronounced by our dear Health Minister, Mr. Fahrettin Koca. Based on these two pieces of evidence, I'm going to try to fashion an outlook for Turkish economy. Let's start with domestic news. That's the health news. The health minister, Mr. Fahrettin Koca, gives monthly briefings on the progress of the epidemic in Turkey. And yesterday, he has very good news. He said, with some perseverance and obedience to social distancing measures, we could see the peak of this epidemic within a week or two. Of course, that means a month after that, most of the restrictions on the movement of goods, services, and people will be will be ended, and Turkish economy will return to normal. At the same time, IMF was releasing its new forecasts for the world and Turkey as well, which were disastrous. IMF expects the biggest contraction in the world economy since the Great Depression. In numbers, 3% this year, to be followed by a 5% recovery next year, but don't let the percentages fool you. In 2020 and 2021, the cumulative output loss of this poor planet would be $9 trillion, or twice the annual GDP of Japan. For Turkey, IMF forecast a 5% GDP decline this year, to be followed by a 5% increase next year. In other words, at the end of 2021, Turkish GDP would barely return to end of 2019 levels. And in terms of per capita, that's per head, it's going to be much lower. I'm sorry, my math is very poor, but since the population would have grown roughly 2.25% in the interim, it obviously would be sharply lower. For those of you who are following Turkish economics, IMF's research team anticipates very little current account deficit, and of course, I agree with that, and roughly 12% CPI inflation for each of the forecasting years, also a reasonable forecast. So, based on this IMF forecast and what Mr. Fahrettin Koca says, a picture emerges in the Turkish economy. By the end of April, the outbreak will reach a peak, which means following international examples and standards, in May, the restrictions would be gradually lifted. By June, the economy will be ready to resume normal activity. And incidentally, I think this is the kind of thinking that goes into government's economic planning, which, despite a rapid decline in central banks' FX reserves and tremendous pressures on the exchange rate, refuses to cut a deal with IMF or to seek for alternate sources of FX funding. Not that they're available. In the sense that, well, I mean, if the economic stress is going to continue now for another month and a half, well, we can just tighten our belts and for it to end. To me, both the IMF forecast and the health ministry forecast are extremely optimistic. And let me tell you why that I think the epidemic will not peak by end of April. As you know, there was a sudden curfew announcement last Friday. I think the announcement came around 8 p.m., and it declared a curfew by midnight. As a result, including myself, I went out for items I can't mention here because there are children around, apparently. But people went out for bread, which is an absolute necessity for every Turkish home, and other necessities. And there were visual evidence in every TV station that social distancing measures were ignored. So many health experts, some of which serving in the National Science and Health Committees, told the public that they expect a bump in new corona cases in roughly 2 weeks. Well, that's the primary evidence I'm using to tell our beloved health minister that he may be slightly too optimistic. Two, if my calendar is not wrong, on 23rd of April, we're going to celebrate both the start of Ramadan, the holy month of feasting, as well as the opening, the first parliament of the Turkish Republic. Now, for those of you who are not Muslims, Ramadan is a month where most Turks say or do really fast, but there are large public gatherings as well as people visiting their families, relatives, and neighbors in the same apartment to do prayers or just to chat. And that's a very strong tradition. Then at the end of the Ramadan comes the 3-day Eid holiday, which we call Bayram in Turkey, during which most of the people who migrated from villages, which is most of us in Turkey, we have a rural background, go back to their hometowns to visit their parents or elders. And once again, cemeteries, relatives, and friends are visited, hands are kissed, cheeks are hugged, kids are, given money and napkins, etc., etc. These are very strong traditions which have so far withstood any kind of war, earthquake, or epidemic. And I am wondering, and I'm asking for answers from the health minister, how these social pressures will be handled, given the fact that a persistent minority in the Turkish population, even now, refuses to abide by the social distancing measures. So I make the presumption that it is reasonable to expect for this epidemic not to peak before the end of the May. And there is also already visual evidence. Today, I don't read all the newspapers, but Hürriyet, which is pro-government, and Sözcü, which is anti-government, have published pictures of people immediately ignoring uh, advice for home quarantine and merrily frolicking in parks, gardens, and packing into open bazaars to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. Apple, like Google, is tracking human traffic via its applications. I think it's CIA doing that, but I'm not going to get into it because there are children around. So when I said CIA, something beeped. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure there's already an armed drone on its way to my home, thanks to Apple. Anyhow, Apple reported a threefold increase in social traffic, in social activity since the curfew. So I don't want to go on too long on this, but to me, a reasonable date for the peak of the corona outbreak in Turkey is roughly May. And it will take at least until July for all the restrictions to be lifted. And this is how we should calculate our economic scenarios. If this is the case, then several things should also be considered. A, we have lost the tourism season, which has generated $26 billion of net revenue last year and is the cause of at least 1 million net employment. So the government will have to reckon with these losses in addition to what it is trying to compensate right now. Already, I have seen reliable forecasts of up to 3.2 million unemployed until then. Two, Turkey has insufficient resources to deal with the kind of economic misery that would ensue between now and June and July. Already, March budget deficits were 46 billion liras or $7.5 billion, which is a historic record. And Turkey has very little ability to borrow abroad and domestically. I have read a report by TEPAL, an Ankara-based independent think tank, where two researchers have devised a simple model to estimate the output losses based on the share of activities in GDP and potential losses in those activities like entertainment, travel, logistics, tourism, etc. And the results are daunting. On average, each month this outbreak and the resulting restrictions continue, Turkey may lose 3% of its annual output. That would mean roughly $25 billion, depending on which exchange rate we're using. And clearly, a country like Turkey, much like many other emerging nations, doesn't have the wherewithal to compensate all the losses, which means several companies, despite the relief packages, will go bankrupt. This means, despite the widespread welfare safety net, some people will not get unemployment benefits and will have to use their savings, if there is any, or will have to borrow. There is another problem. Private banks, state banks are already lending to anyone they can get their hands on, if I understand it correctly. And it is also, I can also see it in data. But private banks are reluctant to lend for the simple reason that they understand many of the small and medium-sized companies will not return, simply because by the time the health crisis ends, the economic crises will not end. For instance, tourism, most of the retail, in particular high-end retail, energy companies, which have already undergone a serious amount of restructuring, most of logistics, some of the exporters, part of automotive will not recover that easily because EU is not recovering, because the epidemic is just gaining pace in Russia, and the situation in Middle East is completely unresolved, as well as in North Africa. These are our main trading partners. And no matter what we do here, even if the World Health Organization certifies Turkey as completely virus-free, as long as there are restrictions in Europe, they're not going to export from Turkey, or they're not going to come visit Turkey. If entire Moscow is sick, we're not going to get too many Russian tourists, which means which means fruit juice prices will go down. As a result, Turkish economy will probably show an output contraction of 5%. On that, I agree. But it will not recover as rapidly in 2021, simply because some of the employment losses will be permanent, because some of the companies will have shut down, and it will take a longer time for more competitive, more efficient firms to take their place. Two, banks will have used most of their ammunition, their funding capacity during the crises, and to collect those loans back will take a year or longer. Three, the government and the central bank will have used fiscal and monetary stimulus to the hilt, and they will not be able to help the economy in the most critical phase when it is recovering from the health crises. Three, and most importantly, and everyone, most economists are emphasizing this viewpoint. We don't fully understand how consumer behavior, human behavior, will be affected by this health crisis, but it will be affected. A few things we can already tell. Probably social interaction will remain suppressed for a long time. Two, we'll probably save more, and we will keep larger stocks of food and healthcare products at home, etc., etc. As a result, final household consumption, which makes up roughly 60% of the Turkish economy, will not come back. And most importantly, The evidence of the great financial crises that shook the world in 2008, 2009 showed us that the animal spirits have not returned for a decade. Animal spirits, as mentioned by Mr. Keynes. That is, the private sector has substantially decreased its fixed investment. And that has also been evident in Turkey for a variety of other reasons as well. And now, imagine a situation where companies have taken on more leverage to survive during the crises. Foreign and domestic demand is more moderate compared to the pre-crisis area. And they are less certain about a future, which suddenly sprung up several black swans over the period of 12 months. Obviously, they will invest less. And a country which has a lower rate of fixed investments to GDP generates a lower rate of long-term growth. Sustainable growth is impaired. I have probably talked too long about that, but it appears to me we will have a square root shaped of recovery. That is, a very sudden decline called a sudden stop. Then, yes, a sudden jump up to a certain point, probably to a pace of 2 to 3% per annum, and then a long period of stagnation around that levels. That is 2 to 3% economic growth per annum for a couple of years, accompanied by double-digit inflation. Can we escape that fate and return to very rapid growth rates? Well, if the health minister is correct, despite my misgivings, possibly. But also we need luck in the sense that Russia, Middle East, and EU needs to recover very fast. Two, an IMF standby by bringing in much needed effects, stabilizing the currency, and helping recapitalize bankrupt businesses and banks with balance sheets could help accelerate the process. But as I've said, the government has made it very clear they want to have nothing to do with IMF for the time being. They may change their views if the health crisis is going to last longer than the health minister anticipates. Okay, this has been my broadcast, and I want to thank all the viewers who are setting aside precious time to listen to my rumblings. You have just watched another episode of Real Turkey Channel presented by Atilla Yeşilada from his home office. And if you like it, please share it with friends or subscribe. Stay home, stay safe. Until next broadcast, bye-bye.